Thanks for being here. Thanks to the Clinton School. Really impressed. And Matt and I, neither of us live in Arkansas anymore. We both did, and just wanted to say how much we love being here. People are incredibly friendly, and it's something you forget and then you remember as soon as you show up again. Just how kind to strangers and polite people in Arkansas are. There's just nothing like it. So I'd written a couple books, and Matt and I'm 8 years senior of Matt, and so we didn't really grow up, hanging out a lot, but we always were kind of close and tried to stay that way. He lives in Washington, I live in Chicago, and so I kept on bugging him saying, hey, we need to write a book together, and so we bounced ideas back and forth. He's quite the foodie, I'm not so much, but I like historical trivia, he does too, and we finally were trying to hit on an idea, and I'd been pitching an agent in New York and with a novel still unpublished, and he was saying he was kind of lukewarm to it. Said maybe, and he said, "Do you have any nonfiction?" And I said, "Well, my brother and I were just talking a day ago about something about famous people in history and what they ate, and we call it What the Great Ate." And he said, "Come to New York," And so we were there instantly, and the rest is a book, at least, if not history. We're here in this great place, and presidents, need to be thought about, and we just want to get the Clinton stuff out of the way, Bill and Hillary.
Yeah, we want to definitely give you some nice anecdotes or background info on Bill and Hillary and what they ate. I don't think it's going to be a shock to any of you that Bill Clinton's tastes were, kind of junk food ridden. He liked very hearty meals. The New York Times, right after he was elected president in 1992, they published an article summing up Bill Clinton, and one of the phrases in there was, President-elect Bill Clinton prefers the stuff with fat in it. That's how they summed up his dietary interest. And the truth is, this goes back to when he was governor of the state. There was a common joke among reporters who were covering the governor when Clinton was in office here. The joke would go, "Oh, is the forklift here with the governor's lunch yet?" This was somebody who ate a lot. There was one biography on Clinton that claims that at one point a staffer actually reached out and snatched a cupcake out of his hand on Hillary's orders. So Hillary watched his diet closely, although Hillary's diet was not always so fat-free as well. The New York Times asked Robert Reich, who ended up serving as labor secretary in the Clinton administration, about the years when he got to know Hillary. And he remembers going to the movies with her in the 1960s, and as he put it, and I remember she put what seemed like an extraordinary amount of butter on her popcorn. So Hillary liked some of the high-fat taste as well, although something that's less known about the Clintons is that their tastes have truly evolved, and I know Mark did some research on that.
Some people are eating the same thing at age 60 that they're eating at age 20. In fact, maybe most people, but the Clintons, their tastes have really changed. In the White House, Hillary always had Boca burgers, these soy burgers, ready. The White House chefs give you a lot of information, and many have written books, and we use that. That was very helpful. But when Hillary was by herself in the White House, what she always asked for was baba ganoush or hummus, good Middle Eastern fare. But Bill always wanted a 24-ounce porterhouse steak with béarnaise sauce and fried onion rings. Now that kind of changed in 2004 when he had the bypass. And the amazing thing is that in an interview with CNN just a few months ago, he pretty much declared that he was almost a vegan. He eats no dairy products now. Who knows? Their diet's evolving, so he could have had a burger yesterday for all I know. But the truth is that he is eating vegetables. He has a protein supplement in the morning, but he is virtually a vegan. He's a vegetarian who doesn't eat many. He's just not drinking milk or anything. So they have changed a whole lot, and Matt and I also wanted to just run down some presidents, and we also, I think, want to try to let you guys know that this is historical trivia, but it's not just trivia. Sometimes what people eat says a lot about them. I think with the Clintons, it says that their mentality and their personal philosophies have changed. George Washington, for example, when he was first inaugurated president, he went home and had lunch all by himself. I think, and he was also kind of an annoying diner. He would tap with his silverware on the table, and he wouldn't talk to people, and he was always seemed to be in a bad mood. And it wasn't, I mean, George Washington was well respected, but he wasn't, a friendly guy to go out and have a beer with. It wasn't that kind of thing. And I think his dining habits do reflect, the way he behaved.
Yeah, I think a pretty big distinction would be someone like Thomas Jefferson. People, you often hear the question asked, if you could dine with anybody in history, who would it be? George Washington, you probably really wouldn't want to have dined with. Thomas Jefferson, this was a person who was a very adventurous eater. He was practically a vegetarian, although he did enjoy meat from time to time. But this was someone who thought about food a lot. He thought about how to grow food and how to cultivate it. He was the person who introduced eggplant to America. He also was eating tomatoes at a time when many Americans were not, because they thought they were poisonous. They would keep them as an ornamental, maybe put them on a windowsill, but they would not dare eat them. He traveled to Europe, and his journals read like a restaurant or food reviewer or critic. He talks about how in Germany he learned that the smallest pig produces the sweetest meat. He went down to France and Italy and tried a variety of wines. At one point in Italy, he watches a farmer who's producing Parmesan cheese, and he painstakingly records every detail of what the farmer does, over 500 words in his journal just about how you make Parmesan cheese. This was somebody who was very meticulous about it. One story that most people don't know about Thomas Jefferson is that he almost did not become the third president of the United States because of food. Here's what happened. So it's 1787. He is in modern-day Italy. He's in the northern part of the country. And he goes into a region called Piedmont, and he tastes the rice and is absolutely taken he just loves this stuff, the texture, the taste. Oh my gosh, I've got to find a way to get this back to America. So he hires a laborer and tells him he wants him to fill 2 sacks full of the rice kernel. He's going to take it back to the United States and show South Carolina's farmers what they're missing. So he does this, even though he knows that this is a capital crime. To take rice out of that region was a capital crime punishable by death. Luckily for the United States, he went undetected. He goes to a port city. He's able to load it up, and he goes back across the Atlantic. And the postscript on this is, for a man who risked his life trying to smuggle really wonderful rice out of the country, he shows this rice to Edward Rutledge, who was a South Carolinian, also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Edward Rutledge and the South Carolina rice farmers had nothing to do with this. We have perfectly good rice down here in South Carolina. We do not need Italy's rice, thank you very much. So Thomas Jefferson had to be a little disappointed at going to quite an effort for that.
Right. Eisenhower, when he first heard that Pearl Harbor had been attacked, did he call on the phone? Did he jump in a staff car to go to headquarters? No, he went to the kitchen and started making vegetable soup. And the reason he did this was, and his son explained this in a book, he always went to the kitchen and cooked whenever he wanted to be alone and think about something extremely important. And I think this says a lot about Eisenhower, just as how he was a very deliberate thinker. He wasn't a brash, he wasn't a patent-like guy who would just go off quickly and make a decision instantly. He liked to think about things. So I always like to think about Eisenhower in the kitchen cooking vegetable soup. And when I think about, when I am worried I'm making a decision too quickly, I think I like to go to the kitchen too. Grover Cleveland, another example of how food reflects how somebody thinks and how they behave. Grover Cleveland, when he became president, he took over for Chester Arthur, and Arthur had this French cook, and Grover Cleveland hated that. He just wanted a pork chop. That's all he wanted. He just wanted just regular American food. And Matt and I were talking yesterday about how that you see this, in ancient times, you see kind of royalty wanting fancy foods and even using that to kind of express how important they are. But in American food, a lot of times, there was people were not putting on airs. The Clintons, for example, when they came to the White House, they went for a strictly American fare. They were into being locavores even before it became popular. But Grover Cleveland is showing up for dinner, and he knows he's going to hate it again because it's more French food. So he gets this whiff of corned beef and cabbage coming from the servants' quarters at the White House, and he tells his valet, "Go and get their food and bring it to me and send the French food down there." So that's what they did. And I've always wondered whether the servants were happy or sad when they saw the French food show up. And I have no idea.
Jimmy Carter is often labeled as one of the intellectual or most intellectual presidents we've ever had. And it somehow fits when I was reading about his life, his years growing up in Plains, Georgia. And this is astonishing to me, but apparently quite true, that his family typically ate dinner silently. And they were silent because they were reading. Everybody would bring a newspaper or a magazine or a book to the table and read. They did not talk. And if you started talking, they would politely tell you to hush up so they could keep reading. This was just the way it was. The only one at the table who didn't read was Jimmy Carter's father. He had terrible eyesight, and that was the only reason why he wasn't reading. But so he was eating a very silent meal, watching his family members, reading away. And what was stunning to Jimmy Carter's boyhood friends was he'd invite them to dinner occasionally. And you can imagine, their parents are saying, now be sure to mind manners and ask good questions and be polite and be ready to respond if Mrs. Carter asks you something. They weren't asked anything because, of course, they were expected to sit silently and maybe bring some reading material. But it was a very different situation. One of my favorite presidential stories is, food in the White House was cooked in an open hearth for the first, many, many decades of the presidency. In 1840, that changed. And so they were going to install a stove in the White House. And they were all ready to do it, but one of the laborers trying to do it just couldn't figure out how it was going to be installed. Millard Fillmore, the president, asks, what's the matter here? And they say, well, we can't figure out how to hook up this stove. He says, well, this shouldn't be a problem at all. He leaves the White House, walks several blocks to the patent office, and finds the original patent, takes some notes, reads, okay, here's how it works, goes back to the White House, and basically sets up the stove to cook his own meals.
Right.
That's not something I think you'd see these days, but it was a very different situation.
And Fillmore's last words in life were,
yes.
The nourishment is palatable.
Apparently a reference to his last meal.
Yeah.
LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, was a fascinating character. I would call him a food pirate because if you were eating with him, you needed to keep your plate a good distance away. Right. It was not unusual, his aides say, that he would see that you weren't eating whatever food that he was finished. He was finished with his mashed potatoes or his fried okra, and you still had some on your plate, and you didn't seem to be eating it. Well, he'd stab his fork over there and bring some his way. He had terrible indigestion. I mean, this was a man who was very type A, and consequently, he mistook his first heart attack as indigestion caused by hot dogs. Didn't realize it was a heart attack until a doctor said, you've had a heart attack. Those weren't just bad hot dogs.
Right. William Howard Taft, probably our biggest president, and just struggled with food. I mean, biggest in girth. And he struggled, mightily, and he was really embarrassed about it. These jokes went around saying that, hey, Taft gave up his seat on the streetcar and 3 women took his place. That kind of thing. People, and so he was very sensitive about it. They had to put in a bigger bathtub, I believe. Tell the story about the dining car.
Yeah, one evening he's leaving the White House. He's going back to Cincinnati, which was his hometown, and he's had a big dinner at the White House. He leaves, he's taken to the train station. They get on the depot, they're on the train, and he goes up to one of his aides and he says, I want to know where the dining car is. His aide says, well, Mr. President, we didn't put a dining car on because you had dinner at the White House. And he says, well, how can that be? There should be a dining car on here. He said, well, Mr. President, there's not. He goes, I want this train stopped. We're going to put a dining car on. And the aide persists. He says, Mr. President, please, it's going to delay our trip. It's going to cause a problem. Taft's response back to him is, what good is it being president if I can't have a dining car on this train? He got his dining car.
That was the most important.
Yeah. Calvin Coolidge was an odd soul. If you didn't know where Calvin was in the White House, the odds are he was hanging out in the White House pantry where they kept lots of jams and pickles. He was kind of one of these, I'm going to snack on a few items here and there throughout the day, not really a big meal person. He had been vice president, of course, and as vice president, he presided over the Senate. Well, there were Democrats who would just make fun of the Republicans and say, isn't that embarrassing? Your own vice president is sitting over there having lunch, and none of you are dining with him. And they didn't realize the reason why. He was not somebody who made small talk or conversation at all. And Calvin was kind of a strange bird. One of the things he did was he called every meal supper. It could be a state dinner for the Queen of England. It could be breakfast in the pantry. It was all supper. When's supper ready? What are we having for supper? And you didn't know whether he was talking about, the King of Prussia or, somebody else. So.
Well, but he was kind of mean to his wife. He used to make fun of her cooking all the time. One time, she made a pie, and he was making fun of the crust. He said, "We ought to take this crust and give it to the road commissioners, because that way they would know what they could build the roads with, because it was this impermeable substance." Another one of my favorite quotes, presidential quotes, is Abraham Lincoln, and he's in a restaurant, and he's being served a hot beverage, and he drinks it, and he calls the waiter over and says, "Sir, if this is coffee, please bring me tea. If this is tea, please bring me coffee."
Yeah, Richard Nixon, he was succeeded by Gerald Ford, very difficult time, he resigns. Gerald Ford's lasting image in the public eye was created largely by Saturday Night Live, if those of you who were around remember his presidency, as being a real clumsy oaf. Oh, he tripped, he fell. He was going down the stairs of Air Force one time, stumbled, and forever he was kind of branded as, oh, this is the president who's really awkward and can't.
Maybe our greatest athlete president.
That's right, that's right. So it's
All-American football player.
Here's the weird irony. He succeeded the president who probably was our clumsiest president. What happened was Nixon was traveling on his first visit to England. He's at a very formal dinner there. He spills some food on himself, and the experience so just horrifies him that he goes back to the other side of the Atlantic. He's at the White House, and he instructs the staff, "We are never serving soup at any formal state dinner. I don't want to risk any food that I might drizzle or dribble or spill or anything like that." He also, his favorite lunch when he, long before he became president, he started out working in a law firm. His typical lunch at the law firm was a Milky Way candy bar. So.
Right, and he hated string beans because as a kid he picked them. Ronald Reagan also had kind of this childhood fixation that affected his food choices. When he was a kid, another kid handed him a tomato and told him it was an apple, and he bit into it. And Ronald Reagan did not eat another tomato for 70 years.
Yeah.
And of course, Reagan was considered himself a dessert man, is what he put it. And of course, you know about jelly beans. In fact, I have not been to the Reagan Presidential Library, but I hear that there's a portrait of him done in jelly beans.
Right.
Which I'd love to see.
Yeah, chocolate mousse was his favorite dessert, but the White House kitchen staff were not permitted to serve it to him when Nancy was around. Only when she left town did they serve it to the president, because they would have gotten in big trouble if they'd done so otherwise. In the book, we also cover a variety of subjects, not just presidents. We have artists, we have musicians, we have explorers, and one of the chapters we have is on world leaders. And there are some really great stories. One of the things Mark and I are quick to point out, when we say the greats, we don't necessarily mean nice, likable people you'd want to invite over. We consider...
Great is not good.
Yeah, great can be both famous and infamous. And so we have some anecdotes in here from people ranging from Joseph Stalin to Adolf Hitler. Hitler was a person who was sort of tormented by food, and I kind of took some pleasure at knowing that. He had frequent stomach problems and ailments, and for that reason, principally for that reason, he pretty much stuck to a vegetable diet. He did eat a little bit of meat here and there, but by and large, he didn't want to do that. When the last several months of the war, people who were with him, who recorded in diaries, say that the only two subjects you could get Hitler to talk about when it was very clear the war was lost for Germany were either his dog and his diet. I mean, he was obsessive about diet and nutrition to the very end. In his personal collection, he had almost 1,000 books dealing with diet and nutrition, and many of them had handwritten notes scribbled in about certain portions or excerpts that were particularly meaningful to him. One of my favorite stories is 1923, the birthday party. You remember that one? He wouldn't eat, he would not try his own birthday cake. And a colleague comes up to him and says, Adolf, why won't you, this is your birthday, you should have the birthday cake. He was nervous because the birthday party was being held in an apartment house whose landlord was Jewish. So here was this person who was so obsessed with Jews, and his anti-Semitism so took control of him that he wasn't going to have a piece of his own birthday cake in 1923.
Right. Joseph Stalin was very much, at a dinner table, he was pretty much the way he was when he was purging half of the people in Russia. He would invite people to dinner, and he would pull pranks on him, and cruel pranks. Like he'd put a tomato in a chair that one of his ministers was going to sit on, and they'd all laugh at him. He would order the cook to put more a lot more pepper in one person's food during a dinner just to see how they would react. And an aide said that, I mean, Stalin also used to just joke about poisoning the food, which is really would make dinner especially pleasant. And an aide said you never knew when you went to dinner with Stalin whether you would be led away to Siberia or be allowed to go home. I mean, so that's the kind of story I think that in the book reflects. It's not just food trivia. It really reflects the greater personality and the way they behaved.
Yeah, Benito Mussolini, the premier in Italy, he had a lot of stomach problems like Hitler. It's kind of nice to know these people were giving the rest of the world indigestion. At least they suffered some themselves. He drank immense amounts of milk. He would drink probably 4 or 5 quarts of milk every day. He thought that would keep his stomach at bay. He once invited the Greek premier over for dinner, and he might as well not have invited him over because the only people he would talk to were the attendants. He never said a word to the Greek ruler. His famous food phrase, though, had nothing to do with food, and that was his wife's mother lived with the family, and of course they had a household of kids as well. So he was fearful of making anybody feel worried or nervous, and so he had a code phrase that he would use back when he was battling communist street gangs. His fascist street gangs would get together. They would literally duel with swords. So he had a code phrase he used every morning to his wife to let her know that they would be engaging in dueling later that day. And the phrase was, today we're making spaghetti.
Saddam Hussein became obsessed with Kellogg's Raisin Bran Crunch while he was being held prisoner by the Americans shortly before his execution. And he hated that they wouldn't always bring him Kellogg's Raisin Bran Crunch. And he reportedly started shouting one time, "No Fruit Loops! No Fruit Loops!" He did not want them to bring him any Fruit Loops.
Yeah. I mean, here was a man who had to know he was at death's door, and he's fussing about what kind of breakfast cereal he served. There's something about that. One of my favorite stories in the book is Francois Mitterrand, the French president. He leaves office and he's diagnosed with cancer, and he knows that his days are numbered. And he decides he's going to have this one big, last, multi-course, fantastic meal. The main course of the meal is a songbird, a very delicate bird called an ortolan. And it was an endangered species, so this meal was illegal. The fact that they were even having it, and it's cooked the way that only the French seem to cook things, which is the bird was killed by drowning it in Armagnac brandy. Then its feathers are plucked very meticulously, and then it is roasted whole, and then it is eaten whole, bones and all.
And the amazing thing is the way is
Yes.
that in order to eat it, you have to wear a napkin over your face. This is traditionally the way that you ate an ortolan, and that nobody knows where the tradition came from. It's either to savor the aroma as you're eating it, or because Frenchmen should be ashamed to eat the bird.
They interviewed somebody who attended the dinner, and they said, how did Mitterrand look? And he said after the meal, he looked like someone who was ready to accept his impending death. There's a good story in the book about Juan Perón, the Argentine leader, who right after the years of World War II have ended, no longer all the Allies getting their grain and other provisions from Argentina, which was happening at that time. The country's prosperity has collapsed, and he publicly announces to his people that he and his governmental ministers have been perusing their garbage bins. And you know what? We see that you're throwing away an awful lot of meat and bread, so much it could feed the city of Buenos Aires, so stop it.
Would you tell the Marie Antoinette, explain?
Yeah.
What I want to explain is that in this book, we found tons of, we just read for years all these biographies, sped to speed reading. And by the way, if you go to the index and look for favorite food, it's not there. So you have to go and then, on page 325, here's this great story. And I would email Matt and say, hey, we got a great story. But it was very time consuming. But the mission wasn't just to find good stories about famous people and food. It was also to make sure they were true, or if they weren't true, to kind of characterize them as legends. And the Marie Antoinette thing, you did a good job of looking into that.
I'm going to tell that story, and then we'll wrap up and take questions from you all. We're probably a little past our speaking time. But it's a great story. So you've all heard it, right? Let them eat cake. That's the phrase that history has bequeathed to Marie Antoinette, this heartless queen, and she's so out of touch with her people. The latter is probably true. She was out of touch, but that statement itself, she did not make the original statement. The statement originated decades earlier. A French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, actually used that phrase in a different context. And the other thing that history doesn't really explain carefully is, as is always the case when you're translating a language, there is that wonderful thing called an idiom. It doesn't translate so cleanly. And the phrase that she used was really, let them eat a roll. The term was brioche, which means roll. It's not anybody who's been to Europe or had a brioche in some fancy cafe will tell you this is not cake. It might be a very enjoyable roll, but it is a roll. But it occurred to Mark and I that if you were trying to foment a revolution, it probably worked much better to tell everybody, you know what she said? She said, let them eat cake. My goodness, let's all rise up.
Let them eat rolls is not going to, make people nearly as mad, although slightly mad considering the French Revolution.
Yeah. So we're more than happy to take any questions that you might have.
Right.
Any
and we centered
comments?
on kind of politicians and stuff, but we also, we did explorers and movie stars and writers and all that and singers, and so we'd love to take questions. Or
raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear you. Right here, Tisha. Hold on one second.
I'm curious, in your research, did you find any people who might have had a certain reputation, but then they might sneak off and engorge themselves with Twinkies or something?
Wow, that's a good question. Trying to think.
Nancy Pelosi has been known to eat chocolate ice cream for breakfast. I mean, I don't know that that's well known. She's a real chocolate-aholic. She loves chocolate, loves Ghirardelli chocolate because she's from San Francisco. But as far as that,
I'm trying to think of any other example that would sort of speak to that. And I don't.
It's funny how. I mean, there was a little bit of people sneaking off and and getting food. I mean, the Grover Cleveland example, and I'm sure Taft was eating all the time, but. I mean, it's a little tough if you're a famous person to get away with, with sneaky eating.
Yeah, I mean, what we did find, and there are numerous examples of it, is people who one evening would be out at a very fancy, posh, Hollywood restaurant. In their heart of hearts, the foods that they really craved were frequently quite ordinary. I mean, there are several examples of this, but Betty Davis loved potatoes. Her nickname, as she was moving into her, career, was Spuds, because she told people frequently, if all the other food was wiped out of the earth and all I had was potatoes, I could live forever. I mean, she loved that. Clark Gable, the actor, he was dying of cancer, and reportedly his last meal was chili served to him from Chasen's, a restaurant in Hollywood that he loved. It was delivered to the hospital where he could eat it. So, I mean, I think the thing that is very clear to us is that you find a number of examples where people we think of as very extraordinary had pretty ordinary taste, the foods that they loved.
Right. Your Betty Davis thing reminded me of Joan Crawford, because they're in that
Yes,
great movie I love, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
Yeah.
Do you remember that, where the rat gets served on a plate? Spoiler alert, the rat gets served on a plate. And when they had the party after the movie, they had a pate in the shape of a rat. That was part of it. And Joan Crawford's really interesting. Her original name was Lucille LeSueur. And so when she wanted to become a star, an actress, they said, well, your last name sounds too much like Sewer. You're going to have to change it. So they said, okay, Joan Crawford. And she thought that sounded too much like crawfish, And a friend of hers said, oh, that's okay. They could just, you ought to just accept crawfish. At least it's better than, if they wanted to call you Cranberry and serve you for Thanksgiving. So he used to call her Cranberry. That was her nickname, Cranberry. So Betty Davis was Spuds and Joan Crawford was Cranberry.
Quite a team. Yes.
Hi, my name's Erin Stock. I'm a student here. So I have a two-part question. First, did you identify any patterns in journalists or actors or presidents either eating behaviors or eating preferences? And then secondly, where did you get your research for this? I mean, where do you find documentation on what people ate?
Well, if libraries gave out a frequent flyer card, I would have a lot of points. And Mark and I spent a lot of time on that. And we have to do a little quick shout out here for Google Books. It's amazing what in this day and age, you can run down through the internet that 20, 30 years ago, you just wouldn't have been able to
Because
find.
what we would do, and I know my wife thinks I'm insane for this, but I would sit in front of a computer and type in Eisenhower breakfast, do a search. Eisenhower lunch, Eisenhower meat, Eisenhower beef, Eisenhower vegetables. And literally we went through thousands of people and thousands of permutations.
It occurred to me that if somebody had been eavesdropping and leaning over our shoulder, looking at what we were doing searches on, they would have been walking away, scratching their heads like, Clinton and pineapple. What? What's this,
So that's part of it. And I mean, you really have to try to debunk a lot of stuff. It's tough. We ran across a story that Elvis Presley ate 65,000 calories a day, which is the equivalent of what an Asian elephant would eat daily. Well, Elvis ate a lot, let me tell you, but he didn't eat that much. That's pretty much impossible. And so we ran across that, and my first thought was, that's great, we got to put it in the book. And my second thought was, that's probably not true. And so we contacted a nutrition expert, and she just kind of worked the numbers for us on what the maximum that a person could consume per day, and it wasn't anywhere close, of course.
As far as the patterns question you asked about, I'm not sure that there are really clear patterns as far as, artists tend to eat this way or writers write this way. What we did find, because when you talk about greats, you're talking about people who are incredibly driven people, a bit obsessed with their craft, whatever that craft is, whether it's acting or sculpting or being an engineer or anything else. But you did find those people for whom food just truly didn't matter. A couple examples, you can talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. I think he's a very good example. But one of them that I like is, the Southern novelist from Mississippi, William Faulkner. So Faulkner gets an invitation in the mail from the White House. Jackie Kennedy has invited him to dinner at the White House with the president herself, and he decides to decline the invitation, and he tells this to a friend nonchalantly, and the friend says, you've got to be kidding me. You turned down a White House dinner invitation? And Faulkner's one-line response when he was asked why he turned it down was, that's a long way to go just to eat.
I think with greats, you find extremes. You find, he mentioned Napoleon. Napoleon never took more than 15 minutes to eat. He did not, he ate pretty well, but he did not like eating, and he didn't like the waste of time. I think we found kind of two different kind of groups, those who wanted to be expressive and creative with food, and those who just wanted to, quickly eat it and be gone. One of my favorite Napoleon stories is after one of his great victories, whenever he won a big victory in battle, he would come back to France, and they would have a big party, and they would have a rabbit hunt and all this stuff. And so he goes to the rabbit hunt, and and they're all ready for that, and they release these like 500 rabbits from these cages, and instead of running off so they can chase them, the rabbits charged Napoleon and his group, charged at him, so one of them even jumped in Napoleon's arms, and he so alarmed them that they had to run into their carriage and go away, horribly embarrassed and surprised. And it turned out that the people who were supposed to arrange the thing, they had gotten domesticated rabbits who just thought that Napoleon was going to feed them. They were supposed to get wild ones, but instead they got the domesticated ones.
Right, and back.
True or false? I have read that during the days of the Roman Empire, they would employ whole relays of slaves to run snow from the Alps into the city of Rome for ice desserts in the summer. Is that true?
I'm going to say that's true.
You think?
I think part of that's true. I know that that rich people in even arid regions used to have snow. I know during the Crusades, Saladin gave Richard the Lionhearted snow as a gift. Once when he heard he was sick, even though they were bitter enemies, they were kind of being chivalrous with each other. I know he gave him snow. So, I don't know that specifically, but to me it seems logical.
Yeah, you were dealing with a world, of course, with a very large labor force.
Right, that you didn't have to pay overtime.
Slavery and things, and yeah, it certainly facilitated things like that. There were a lot of, the Roman stories in the book. We have several Roman emperors that are cited in the book, and it's very tricky to try and make head or tail of which ones you can believe and you can't. There were some that seemed very over the top that we just didn't think were worth putting in. They seemed too too suspicious. But there were some interesting ones like the first century Emperor Domitian. He actually set up a council of advisors to solve this question: what is the best way to cook a large turbot that has been fished out of the Adriatic Sea? So these people definitely thought about food.
Right there.
This kind of dovetails with your question a bit. What is the earliest anecdote that you were able to actually verify and possibly include in the book?
Oh, verify. That's a tough thing.
Yeah.
The earliest anecdote in the book is Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Who Adam and Eve, historical scholars had great doubt that it was an apple that Adam and Eve ate. I mean, because the Bible just says it was forbidden fruit, and it could have been a pomegranate, it could have been a fig, it could have been a peach. There's a lot of speculation about that, and the apple became popular only when the Teutonic tribes adopted Christianity, and there already was kind of an apple myth in the Teutonic culture. And that's why that got chosen as the kind of forbidden fruit, but there's really no proof it was.
Yeah. And there's some indication that apples, from tests and studies they've done, that they don't think there's any evidence that apples were growing in the Holy Land at that time. So yeah, could it have been a fig or an apricot, and you know.
So that I think that's safe to say that's the earliest anecdote. But as far as verified, boy, that's a tough one.
Yeah. I mean, I think you know, it can be very tricky, and you even find different books that tell the same story different ways. One of the things we got tangled into this thing over, there's a Latin phrase meaning faster than you can cook asparagus. And this phrase was actually, there are multiple scholars who say it was used by Caesar way back when. And, you know, but then there's dispute about, was it Caesar Augustus or was it a different Caesar? And, you know, it's not easy to verify stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very tough. It's been a lot in modern times. You know, for celebrities, almost their entire life is an open book to some extent. But it's very tough in the old days, and there've been a lot of mistakes made just because people translated a word wrong, and for the next 3 centuries, somebody thought something that wasn't true. I mean, there's a lot of examples of that.
Well, you guys told me what your favorite thing was to eat earlier, which was pulled pork and crab. What's your favorite thing to make?
Oh.
Pies. I don't claim to be a great pie maker, but there's just something very, it's paste. You can mix it up with different filling, you know. When I have time, right around Thanksgiving time, you know, making a pie or two is nice.
I make, in the wok, I make something called Happy Family, which is pretty much virtually every Chinese food you could possibly put in the wok at the same time. Shrimp and chicken and, you know, and pea pods and all that. And I like to do that because cooking in a wok is not precision work. You just pretty much, whatever. Matt's the foodie, I'm the eatie.
One more.
Hi, my name's Spencer Locker, and I'm a student here. Thanks so much for coming. Since it's Thanksgiving week, did y'all look into any holiday fare among the famous people, or you know, any trends for different holidays for all?
Yeah, on the website, we actually, our book's website, we have a blog on the homepage, and we update that 2 or 3 times.
And what's it called,
a
Matt?
week. It's whatthegreat8.org. Thank you, Mark, for asking that question. But when we did a post recently, Mark uploaded a post about, it was connected to Thanksgiving, about some of the foods that people liked.
Right.
John Adams' favorite.
With bacon-wrapped chicken livers, which doesn't sound that great.
Yeah.
But, and one thing that was interesting is Arthur Miller and his wife were vegetarians, so they built a fake turkey out of vegetables. They would make it. Must have been beautiful. I wish I could find pictures of it.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite stories is actor George C. Scott, who liked to cook a great deal, had his family together, and they were ready to, you know, have a great Thanksgiving, and they were cooking a lot of the foods and so forth. He also was he loved his dogs. He had a German Shepherd, but there was a Dalmatian floating around the neighborhood, and he wanted purebred German Shepherds. He did not want any other kind of German Shepherd, and he looked through the window and noticed that something had started to happen between the Dalmatian and his German Shepherd, and so he rushes out. He calls all his family members together, and they are trying to break up this event. and they went to such an extent that some of the kids grabbed food items,
Started throwing them.
pies and other things that were meant to be eaten that evening at the dogs to break them up. The German Shepherd got so angry that it bit one of them. And so long and short, their Thanksgiving dinner that evening was scrambled eggs and I think some bacon.
Right.
Hi, I'm Fernando Koontz, also a student here. Thank you guys once again for coming. And I actually have a joint question here with Thesia. And our question is, could you talk a little bit about the death row, the last meals, and maybe what are some of the strangest or craziest meals you guys saw? Thank you.
Oh, we didn't get into that very much. There's also actually a separate book called all about the last meals that has recently came out that's probably pretty good. I think we're going to whiff on that one.
Yeah. I mean, the closest I can come to that would not be the death of a villain, but a death of somebody who was very much beloved in this country, John F. Kennedy. We know what he ate for his final meal, which was actually 47 years ago this very day, when he was in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. He began the day having breakfast in Fort Worth. He had soft-boiled eggs, toast, bacon, marmalade, orange juice, and coffee. Then he gets into the limoed convertible, and they drive, of course, into Dallas, and the rest is history. But that was the last meal he ate. But we at one point we were debating: do we want to bring in some more of these sort of last meal and also kind of the death row? But there is a book that actually covers that stuff, and part of the reason why I think we stayed away from that was we kind of thought, well, that base has sort of been covered. But there's some interesting ones out there.
And they used to, Texas used to have those all online. They don't, I think they don't anymore. It used to be like a real cool and heavily traveled section of their website of the prison system. Here's the last meals, and as you well know, Texas produces many executed people. So, but they took that, I think decorum after a while, they realized that might not be in the best taste, and so they've taken that down now.
Back to Arkansas and coming home.
Thanks so much.